In the spring of 1945, three Allied armies converged on the shattered remains of Nazi Germany. American forces swept through Bavaria toward Hitler's mountain retreat at Berchtesgaden. British and Canadian troops pushed across the North German plain toward Hamburg and the Baltic coast, and from the east, Soviet armies closed in on Berlin itself. Each would discover something remarkable. Rooms full of uniforms, medals, personal letters, artwork, and everyday objects belonging to Adolf Hitler. For a man who dominated headlines for 12 years, and whose face appeared on millions of propaganda posters, surprisingly little of his personal property survives today. The uniforms he wore almost daily have largely vanished. His medal collection, which he displayed prominently on every tunic, exists only in fragments. Even his furniture, his tableware, his books, objects that filled multiple residences, have disappeared into a fog of looting, burning, secret archives and Cold War secrecy. This is the story of what happened to Hitler's personal effects after his death. Where they went, who took them, and why so few exist in museums today. The capture of Hitler's personal possessions occurred at three primary locations in the final weeks of the European War. Each site yielded different categories of material, and each fell to different Allied forces, which shaped the fate of what was found there. The first location was the Berghof, Hitler's private residence on the Obersalzberg mountain above the town of Berchtesgaden in Bavaria. Construction of the Berghof began in 1936 as an expansion of a modest alpine house Hitler had purchased in 1933. By 1939, it had become a sprawling complex with a great hall featuring a massive retractable window overlooking the Alps, multiple guest rooms, staff quarters, a bowling alley, and a cinema. Hitler spent more time at the Berghof than anywhere else during the war years, conducting military conferences and hosting foreign dignitaries. The house contained extensive wardrobes of uniforms, civilian clothing, personal papers, artworks, books, and everyday objects accumulated over years of residence. On April 25, 1945, Royal Air Force bombers struck the Obersalzberg complex. The raid destroyed much of the Berghof's upper floors and started fires that consumed wooden structures and furnishings. However, the building's lower levels and the extensive tunnel system beneath it remained largely intact. Inside these tunnels and basement areas, enormous quantities of Hitler's property had been stored for protection from air raids. When American troops of the 3rd Infantry Division arrived on May 4th, they found the burned shell of the main house and a labyrinth of undamaged storage rooms below. The second location was Hitler's apartment in Munich at Prinzregentenplatz 16. This 9-room apartment had served as Hitler's official Munich residence since 1929. Unlike the Berghof, which was a country retreat, the Munich apartment functioned as his primary civilian address and contained different categories of possessions. Older uniforms from the early party period, civilian suits, artwork he'd collected before becoming Chancellor, furniture from his pre-power days, and personal papers dating back to the 1920s. American forces of the 7th Army captured Munich on April 30, 1945, the same day Hitler died in Berlin. The apartment was seized intact with minimal damage. Infantry officers secured the building and posted guards, while intelligence officers photographed and catalogued the contents. The third location was Berlin, specifically the Führerbunker beneath the Reich Chancellery Garden, and Hitler's apartment in the old Reich Chancellery building nearby. The Führerbunker was a 2-level underground shelter completed in 1944. The upper level contained staff rooms, kitchens and storage. The lower level held Hitler's personal suite, conference rooms, and accommodations for his inner circle. Hitler moved into the bunker permanently in January 1945 and died there on April 30th. Soviet forces captured the Reich Chancellery complex on May 2nd after Hitler's staff had already fled or surrendered. The Soviets found the bunker largely intact but partially burned. German personnel had attempted to destroy sensitive materials by setting fires in several rooms. However, Hitler's bedroom, sitting room and adjacent spaces survived with furnishings, clothing and personal items still present. Several of Hitler's uniforms hung in a wardrobe in his bedroom. His apartment in the nearby Old Chancellery, which he had used before moving to the bunker, also remained accessible to Soviet investigators. These three sites yielded different types of material, because Hitler used them for different purposes at different stages of his life. The Munich apartment contained the oldest items from his early political career. The Berghof held the largest quantity of material accumulated during his years in power. The Berlin bunker contained his final possessions, the items he had with him in his last months. The critical factor determining what survived was which Allied force captured which location. American troops took the Berghof and Munich. Soviet forces took Berlin. This division created two parallel chains of custody, two separate stories of what happened next. When American soldiers of the 3rd Infantry Division reached the Obersalzberg on May 4, 1945, they encountered a surreal scene. The Berghof's roof had collapsed. Walls stood exposed to the sky, but in the tunnels and basement levels beneath the destruction, rooms full of Hitler's property remained organised and undamaged. Sergeant Kenneth Hager of the 506th Infantry Regiment was among the first Americans to enter the underground storage areas. In interviews conducted decades later, he described finding rooms stacked with wooden crates containing artwork, rooms lined with racks of uniforms, and storage chambers filled with furniture covered in protective cloth. The scale of material was overwhelming. Hitler had not simply lived at the Berghof. He had maintained it as a permanent residence with redundant supplies of everything he might need. The American military's official response to this discovery was swift but inadequate. Army intelligence officers arrived within hours to secure what they deemed important: documents, maps, military records, and items that might have intelligence value. Everything else fell into a grey zone. The Army's policy was clear regarding military equipment. Weapons, vehicles, and munitions were to be collected and destroyed or repurposed. But Hitler's personal clothing and household goods fit no established category. They were neither military hardware nor official state documents. In this vacuum, individual soldiers made decisions. Some took items as souvenirs, others photographed the rooms and left. Still others, recognizing the historical significance, attempted to preserve what they found. The result was chaos. Over the following weeks, as more American units passed through the area, the picking over of Hitler's possessions intensified. Items walked out of the tunnels in backpacks and duffel bags. No systematic inventory was conducted. No central authority took custody. Certain high-value items did receive special treatment. Hitler's personal photo albums containing thousands of images from his private life were confiscated by Army intelligence and eventually transferred to the National Archives in Washington. Several paintings from his collection, some of significant artistic value, were secured by the Monuments Men, the Allied unit responsible for protecting cultural property. But the vast majority of mundane objects, the uniforms, the tableware, the linens, the everyday possessions that filled a household, were simply left. In June 1945, German civilians from Berchtesgaden began entering the ruins. The Americans had posted guards, but the site was enormous and impossible to fully secure. Local residents scavenged for anything useful: furniture, kitchenware, fabric from curtains and upholstery. Some items were taken because they had practical value in a devastated economy. Others were taken as historical mementos. Pieces of Hitler's possessions dispersed into homes across Bavaria, where they remained hidden for decades. By late 1945, the American military decided to demolish what remained of the Berghof to prevent it from becoming a neo-Nazi shrine. Explosives brought down the remaining walls in April 1952. The tunnel entrances were sealed with concrete. Anything left inside was buried forever. Today, only the foundations remain, barely visible beneath overgrown vegetation. The fate of Hitler's Munich apartment followed a different trajectory. Because it was captured intact and located in an urban setting, American authorities could control access more effectively. Military police secured the building immediately, and intelligence officers catalogued the contents room by room. Photographs from this process survive in the National Archives, showing the apartment exactly as Hitler had left it years earlier when he departed for Berlin in 1939. The apartment contained 9 rooms: an entrance hall, a dining room, a library, Hitler's bedroom, a guest room, a sitting room, an office, a kitchen, and staff quarters. Each room was photographed extensively. The bedroom contained a simple wooden bed, a nightstand, a wardrobe, and a desk. The wardrobe held several uniforms and civilian suits. The desk drawers contained personal papers, including letters from the 1920s. The library held approximately 1,500 books, many with Hitler's personal bookplate. American authorities faced a decision: what to do with all of this? The intelligence value of documents was clear, and those were removed for analysis, but the furniture, the clothing, the everyday objects presented a problem. Should they be preserved as historical evidence? Destroyed to prevent them from becoming relics? Auctioned to offset occupation costs? While American forces were processing Hitler's property in Bavaria, Soviet troops in Berlin were conducting their own investigation. The Red Army had fought its way into the city block by block through April 1945, and by May 2nd they controlled the government quarter. On May 3rd, Soviet intelligence officers entered the Reich Chancellery and discovered the entrance to the Führerbunker. What they found inside became one of the most closely guarded secrets of the early Cold War. Stalin himself took personal interest in what the bunker contained, not because he cared about Hitler's possessions, but because he needed proof of Hitler's death. Stalin suspected, publicly at least, that reports of Hitler's suicide might be Western propaganda and that Hitler had escaped. Soviet investigators from SMERSH, military counterintelligence, and the NKVD, state security, conducted exhaustive searches. They discovered Hitler's bedroom on the lower level of the bunker, a small room approximately 12 feet by 15 feet. Inside stood a narrow bed, a nightstand, a small desk, and a wardrobe. The wardrobe contained several uniforms, including tunics, trousers, and caps. Each uniform had been tailored to Hitler's measurements. Each bore the 3 badges he always wore on the left breast: the Iron Cross First Class, the Wound Badge in black, and the Golden Party Badge. The Soviets photographed everything. They catalogued the condition of each item. They removed the uniforms carefully and transported them to Moscow as evidence. The goal was to establish a complete record of Hitler's final days, his physical condition, his mental state, and the circumstances of his death. The clothing was part of that evidentiary chain. In a pit near the bunker emergency exit, Soviet investigators discovered the burned remains of 2 bodies. They concluded after forensic examination that these were Hitler and Eva Braun. Near the bodies, they found 2 badly fire-damaged Golden Party badges. The heat had been intense enough to deform the metal and crack the enamel. Soviet records state these badges were recovered from the corpses and photographed in situ. The Soviets also found uniforms in Hitler's apartment in the old Reich Chancellery, less than 100 meters from the bunker entrance. This apartment, which Hitler had used before moving underground permanently, contained a more extensive wardrobe. These uniforms showed signs of fire damage from German attempts to burn sensitive materials before surrendering the area. However, several pieces survived largely intact, and the Soviets confiscated them all. In June 1945, Stalin ordered a comprehensive investigation into Hitler's death. The operation was codenamed Operation Myth. SMERSH and NKVD teams conducted hundreds of interviews with captured German personnel, analysed forensic evidence, and compiled thousands of pages of reports. The clothing and personal effects from the bunker were part of this investigation. They were examined for bloodstains, for signs of poison, for any physical evidence that might confirm or contradict witness testimony about how Hitler had died. By 1948, Soviet investigators concluded their work. The final report confirmed Hitler's suicide. The physical evidence, including the clothing, was transferred to the NKVD archive in Moscow and classified at the highest level. Stalin wanted control over the Hitler narrative, and physical evidence was too valuable to display publicly or share with the West. The captured uniforms were stored in a secure facility in Moscow. In 1954, the KGB took custody when it absorbed elements of the former NKVD. The items remained classified and inaccessible. Soviet authorities occasionally referenced them in official statements, but never allowed independent verification or public viewing. Then in 2000, after the Soviet Union's collapse, the Russian government began cautiously opening some archives. Researchers gained limited access to Hitler-related materials. Photographs of uniforms in storage appeared. The images showed tunics with reinforced loops for pinning medals, the standard method for attaching decorations to German military uniforms. Some tunics had screw-type fastenings instead. indicating that different badges had been used on different uniforms. These photographs confirmed what historians had long suspected. Hitler owned multiple uniforms, and each had a complete set of medals permanently attached. He did not move a single Iron Cross and party badge from one tunic to another each time he changed clothes. He had redundant sets. This explained why multiple golden party badges bearing his party number could exist simultaneously. In 2003, Russian intelligence prepared an exhibition to mark the 60th anniversary of Soviet victory. Among the items to be displayed was a golden party badge identified as Hitler's. The badge was photographed and featured in promotional materials. It appeared in excellent condition, not fire damaged, with clear markings on the reverse indicating party number 1. The provenance seemed solid. It had been recovered during Operation Myth and stored under KGB control for 50 years. The exhibition opened in 2005. Then, a burglary occurred. Someone broke into the display facility overnight and stole 9 Hitler-related items, including the golden party badge. The theft was never solved. Russian authorities suspected either an inside job by embarrassed intelligence officers questioning the badge's authenticity or a commissioned theft by a wealthy private collector. The stolen items have never resurfaced publicly. This incident highlighted the ongoing problem with Hitler artifacts in Russian custody. Verification is nearly impossible. The Soviets controlled the chain of custody completely. No Western researchers had access. Items could be authentic, or they could be substitutes assembled later for propaganda purposes. Without independent examination, certainty remains elusive. Other items from the Berlin bunker fared differently. Hitler's personal library from the bunker, consisting of books kept at his bedside during his final months, was transferred to Moscow and eventually donated to the Library of Congress in Washington through intermediaries in the 1990s. These books, with Hitler's annotations in the margins, are now accessible to researchers. Furniture from the bunker also migrated. A sofa from Hitler's sitting room reportedly ended up in a Soviet officers' club in East Germany and was used casually for years. Its origin was only discovered in the 1980s when a historian noticed construction details matching photographs from 1945. By then, it had been reupholstered multiple times and its historical value was debatable. Among Hitler's personal decorations, 2 were earned through military service in the First World War, the Iron Cross First Class and the Wound Badge in black. These medals had deep personal significance to him, representing his service as a dispatch runner in the Bavarian infantry on the Western Front from 1914 to 1918. He wore them on every uniform every day, from the moment he became Chancellor in 1933 until his death in 1945. The Iron Cross First Class was awarded to Hitler on August 4, 1918, near the end of the war. The recommendation came from his regimental commander, but the specific action that earned the award remains debated by historians. Hitler's duties as a dispatch runner involve carrying messages between regimental headquarters and frontline positions under fire, dangerous work that resulted in numerous casualties among runners. Approximately 218,000 Iron Crosses First Class were awarded during World War I, making it a rare distinction, but not unique. Hitler never wore the ribbon of the Iron Cross Second Class, which he had been awarded in December 1914. The Second Class was a much more common decoration, with 5.2 million awarded. Hitler chose to display only the First Class, which marked him as having performed exceptional service. The Wound Badge in black was awarded to Hitler in May 1918, after he was wounded in a British gas attack near Ypres. The injury caused temporary blindness and required hospitalization for several weeks. The black-grade wound badge indicated 1 or 2 wounds received in combat. Hitler wore it to demonstrate that he had suffered personally for Germany. After 1945, the location of Hitler's actual Iron Cross and Wound Badge became one of the persistent mysteries of captured artifacts. Multiple examples claiming to be Hitler's medals have appeared over the decades, but authentication remains problematic. Unlike the Golden Party Badge, which was custom-made with Hitler's party number engraved on the reverse, the Iron Cross and Wound Badge were standard military awards with no personalization. Thousands of identical medals exist, proving that any specific example belonged to Hitler requires unbroken documentation from the moment of capture to the present. Several medals in private collections today claim this provenance. One Iron Cross first class purportedly taken from the Berghof by an American soldier in May 1945 was auctioned in Monaco in 2014. The auction house provided affidavits from the soldier's family, stating that he had removed the medal from a uniform in the Berghof tunnels and kept it as a souvenir. The medal sold for approximately €60,000. However, historians questioned the documentation. The affidavits were written decades after the fact by individuals who had not witnessed the original taking. The uniform from which the medal was allegedly removed was never documented photographically in 1945. Without stronger evidence, the attribution remains uncertain. Another Iron Cross claiming to be Hitler's appeared in Russia in 2001. A Moscow collector stated that the medal had been recovered from the Reich Chancellery bunker by a Soviet officer in May 1945 and kept in his family until being sold privately. This claim faced similar verification problems. Soviet soldiers certainly took souvenirs from the bunker, and some may have included Hitler's medals. But proving which specific medal belonged to Hitler requires more than family oral history. The fundamental problem is that Hitler owned multiple uniforms and therefore multiple complete sets of decorations. American forces captured some uniforms at the Berghof and Munich. Soviet forces captured others in Berlin. Individual soldiers from both armies took souvenirs. Any of these medals could theoretically be authentic, but without photographic evidence showing the medal on Hitler's tunic at the moment of capture, followed by unbroken documentation of custody, certainty is impossible. The most credible example is an Iron Cross First Class and Wound badge, currently held in a private collection in the United States. These medals were part of a larger grouping of items taken from Hitler's Munich apartment by American intelligence officers in 1945. The items were photographed in the apartment before removal, then documented in US Army intelligence reports filed at the National Archives. The medals were transferred to a military intelligence museum and later sold when the museum closed. The paper trail is strong, though not perfect. Some gaps exist in the documentation between the 1950s and 1980s, but compared to other claimants, this example has the most credible provenance. Photographs of Hitler taken throughout the war show him wearing what appears to be the same Iron Cross on different uniforms, suggesting he did move at least one medal between tunics. However, close examination of photographs reveals slight variations in wear patterns and positioning, indicating he likely had several crosses and rotated them depending on which tunic he was wearing. This multiplicity makes definitive attribution nearly impossible for any single medal. The Golden Party Badge presents a different but equally complex problem. Unlike mass-produced military decorations, each Golden Party Badge was custom-made with the recipient's Nazi Party membership number engraved on the reverse. Hitler's party number should be clearly identifiable, making authentication straightforward. But even here, complications arise. The Golden Party Badge was instituted in October 1933 as a special honour for party members who had joined before November 9, 1933, the 10th anniversary of the Berchof Putsch, and who held party membership numbers between 1 and 100,000. The badge consisted of the standard party pin enclosed in a golden wreath. Recipients received two badges in a presentation case, a large version measuring 30.5mm for wear on uniforms, and a small version measuring 24mm for civilian clothing. Hitler's party membership number is a subject of historical debate. When he joined the German Workers' Party, the precursor to the Nazi Party in 1919, he received membership number 555. The party inflated its membership numbers by starting at 500 to appear larger than it actually was. Some historians also claim Hitler held the number 7 because he was the 7th member of the party's executive committee, though this appears to be a separate designation from party membership. In 1925, when Hitler refounded the Nazi Party after his release from prison following the Berchof Putsch, he was assigned party membership number 1, reflecting his position as party founder and leader. His official Nazi Party identification document from 1925 clearly shows the number 1. This creates confusion. Should Hitler's Golden Party Badge bear the number 7 or the number 1? In his book Mein Kampf, written in 1924, Hitler stated his party number was 7. However, official party records from 1925 onward list him as number 1. Different badges could have been made at different times bearing different numbers. Further complicating matters is the way Germans write the number 1. In German handwriting, the number 1 is written with a vertical line and a pronounced upper serif, which can resemble the number 7 in English script. This stylistic difference has caused confusion among collectors and historians examining photographs of badge engravings. At least 4 Golden Party badges claiming to be Hitler's have been documented. The first came from Hitler's Munich apartment and is now held in Bavarian state custody. This badge, confirmed as authentic by German authorities, bears the number 1 on the reverse. It was seized from Hitler's housekeeper Annie Winter by Bavarian authorities after the war, when they disputed her claim that Hitler had given it to her. The second badge was sold at auction in 2001. This example is the smaller size version, 24mm, designed for civilian clothing. The number 7 appears on the reverse. The auction catalogue claimed Hitler had presented this badge personally to Otto Meissner, head of the Reich Chancellery, by removing it from his own lapel and pinning it to Meissner's coat. Historians doubt this story. Hitler was never photographed wearing the smaller civilian version of the Golden Party badge. When in civilian clothing, he typically wore nothing on his lapel, or occasionally wore a silver Nazi Party eagle pin, but not the golden badge. Additionally, Meissner received his own Golden Party badge officially in early 1937, part of a group presentation that included senior military commanders. The provenance of this badge is questionable. The third badge appeared at auction in Germany in 2004. This was a large-size badge, 30.5mm, made of solid gold with a screwback attachment. The reverse bore a facsimile of Hitler's signature and the number 7. The auction house claimed this badge had been removed from Hitler's tunic in the Führerbunker on April 27, 1945, and presented by Hitler himself to Magda Goebbels, wife of propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels. 2 affidavits from the 1970s accompanied the badge, purportedly from Hitler's valet Heinz Linger and his photographer Heinrich Hoffmann, describing the badge in detail. However, both Linger and Hoffmann were deceased long before the badge surfaced. This badge has several problems. First, Magda Goebbels was indeed wearing a Golden Party badge when she died on May 1, 1945. After killing her 6 children with poison, she and her husband walked into the Reich Chancellery garden, where Joseph Goebbels shot her and then himself. SS guards poured the remaining gasoline over the bodies and set them alight. Soviet investigators recovered 2 badly burned Golden Party badges from the corpses, one from Joseph Goebbels and one from Magda. Both badges showed severe heat damage. The enamel was cracked and blackened. The metal was partially melted. If Magda had been wearing Hitler's badge, it should show this fire damage. The badge auctioned in 2004 showed no such damage. It appeared in excellent condition. Additionally, the badge bore Hitler's signature on the reverse. Why would a badge intended for Hitler's own use carry his signature? This feature suggests the badge was made for presentation to someone else, not for Hitler himself. Finally, the golden wreath on this badge is off-center, rotated slightly to the right. Would a badge worn by the Führer have such a construction flaw? Perhaps it was repaired after the war, but no documentation supports this. The provenance story claims Soviet forces recovered the badge from Magda Goebbels' bunker room, not from her body. If she had left Hitler's badge in her room and worn her own badge to her death, this could explain why the badge shows no fire damage. However, Soviet records from 1945 make no mention of recovering a pristine golden badge from the bunker rooms. They document only the 2 fire-damaged badges from the bodies. The 4th badge was held by Russian intelligence and appeared briefly in photographs in 2003 during preparations for an exhibition. This large badge bore the number 1 on the reverse and appeared authentic, with solid documentation placing it in Soviet custody since 1945. However, in 2005, it was stolen from the exhibition, along with 8 other Hitler items. The theft was never solved, and the badge has not been seen since. So where does this leave us? Multiple Golden Party badges claiming to be Hitler's exist, but definitive authentication remains elusive. The badge in Bavarian custody from Munich appears most credible, with clear provenance and the number 1 corresponding to Hitler's official party membership. The other examples have documentation problems, suspicious features, or unclear chains of custody. The most likely reality is that Hitler owned multiple Golden Party badges pinned to multiple uniforms, and several of these were captured separately by different individuals in 1945. Some were genuine, Others may have been presentation pieces given to Hitler but never worn. Distinguishing between them now is nearly impossible. The emergence of these contested artifacts raises an uncomfortable question. Why do people want to own Hitler's possessions? And what drives the market that assigns immense value to objects associated with one of history's most reviled figures? The market for Nazi memorabilia began immediately after the war. Allied soldiers took souvenirs from captured sites, viewing them as trophies of victory. Helmets, daggers, medals, flags, uniforms, anything with Nazi symbolism was collected. For most soldiers, these were war souvenirs, no different from Japanese samurai swords or Italian fascist banners. Items associated specifically with Hitler, however, carried different significance. They were not just enemy equipment, but personal effects of the man who had caused the war. In the immediate post-war years, few people were interested in buying such items. Germany was devastated, and Germans wanted to forget the Nazi period, not collect reminders of it. In Allied countries, the objects were curiosities but not yet valuable. Veterans kept them in attics and basements, sometimes forgetting they had them. By the 1960s, attitudes began shifting. A generation of collectors emerged interested in World War II history. They sought authentic artifacts to study, display, and preserve. Military shows and specialized dealers appeared, catering to this growing market. Nazi items became particularly sought after because of their dramatic design and historical importance. SS daggers, Luftwaffe badges, Wehrmacht helmets, all found buyers. Hitler items occupied a unique category. They were the ultimate association pieces. Collectors who owned a Hitler artifact owned a direct connection to the central figure of the war. This drove prices higher. By the 1970s, items authenticated as having belonged to Hitler commanded significant premiums over comparable Nazi artifacts. The market expanded dramatically with the rise of auction houses specializing in historical militaria in the 1980s and 1990s. Hermann Historica in Munich, Alexander Historical Auctions in the United States, and others began holding regular sales featuring Nazi material. Buyers included private collectors, museums, and investors viewing rare historical items as assets. Ethical debates intensified. Critics argued that selling Nazi memorabilia, especially Hitler's personal property, glorified evil and profited from genocide. They noted that neo-Nazis and Holocaust deniers were among the buyers, using authentic artifacts to promote their ideologies. Jewish organizations called for bans on such sales. Defenders of the market argued that these were historical objects, not endorsements of Nazi ideology. Preserving authentic artifacts served educational purposes. Museums needed access to genuine material to create accurate exhibits. Destroying or suppressing Hitler's possessions would not erase history. It would only make that history harder to study. Germany addressed this tension through strict regulations. Selling items displaying swastikas or other banned Nazi symbols is illegal in Germany, except for educational and historical purposes. Items must be sold through licensed dealers who verify buyers are legitimate collectors or institutions, not extremists. Many items from Hitler's Munich apartment and the Berghof remain in Bavarian state custody, explicitly to prevent them from entering private hands. Other countries have no such restrictions. In the United States, the First Amendment protects the sale of Nazi material as a form of free speech and historical commerce. American auction houses freely sell Hitler artifacts to the highest bidder with minimal restrictions. This legal divergence creates a global market where provenance and price matter more than ideology or ethics. Prices reflect this demand. In 2014, an Iron Cross purportedly owned by Hitler sold for €60,000. In 2016, a uniform tunic attributed to Hitler sold for over €200,000. In 2019, a set of Hitler's silverware from the Berghof sold for $45,000. These prices make authentication disputes even more significant. If an item is genuine, it is worth a fortune. If it is not, it is worthless. The incentive to fake provenance is enormous. Unscrupulous dealers create false documentation to support dubious attributions. They fabricate affidavits, forge signatures on letters of authenticity, and invent stories of how items were captured. Genuine Hitler artifacts are so rare and valuable that even a small chance of authentication passing scrutiny makes fraud worthwhile. Experts have developed methods to detect fakes. They examine construction techniques, materials, and wear patterns to confirm objects date to the correct period. They verify documentation against historical records and cross-reference witness statements. They use forensic analysis to detect modern materials or fabrication methods. But even with these tools, certainty remains elusive for many items. The chaos of 1945 created gaps in documentation that can never be filled. Museums face particular challenges. Acquiring Hitler artifacts risks accusations of glorifying Nazism. Displaying them requires careful contextualization to ensure visitors understand the historical significance without romanticizing the objects. Some museums refuse to exhibit Hitler personal effects, arguing that no amount of context can overcome the discomfort such items create. Others believe that authentic artifacts, properly presented, enhance public understanding of history. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington holds a small collection of Hitler-related items, including documents and photographs. These are used primarily for research, not public display. The museum's position is that Holocaust education requires focusing on victims, not perpetrators. Hitler artifacts, in their view, distract from that mission. The German Historical Museum in Berlin takes a different approach. It includes Nazi artifacts in its permanent exhibition on German history, presenting them alongside context about Nazi crimes. Hitler's possessions appear not as trophies, but as evidence of how personality cults function and how totalitarian regimes use symbols to consolidate power. Private collectors face no such ethical constraints. Some collect Hitler items purely as investments. Others are World War II enthusiasts interested in preserving history. A few are Nazi sympathizers drawn to Hitler as an ideological figure. The market does not distinguish. Authentic items command high prices regardless of buyer motivation. This raises a final question. Should Hitler's personal effects exist at all? After the war, some Allied officials advocated destroying everything associated with Hitler to prevent relics from inspiring future extremists. The Berghof was demolished for precisely this reason. The Reich Chancellery was razed. Hitler's graves, first in a shell crater, later in a Soviet facility in Magdeburg, were destroyed and his remains scattered to prevent burial sites from becoming pilgrimage destinations. But total erasure proved impossible. Too many items had already dispersed. Too many soldiers had taken souvenirs. Too many objects had entered private hands. The artifacts exist because history exists. Ignoring them or wishing them away does not change that reality. The question is not whether they should exist, but how we engage with them responsibly. 80 years after Hitler's death, a surprisingly small amount of his personal property survives in verified, publicly accessible collections. The reasons for this scarcity are multiple. Intentional destruction by Germans before the war's end, looting by Allied soldiers, fires at capture sites, Soviet secrecy, loss through negligence, and deliberate suppression to prevent Nazi relics from becoming objects of veneration. What does survive? The United States National Archives holds thousands of documents from Hitler's personal files, including correspondence, military orders, and administrative records. These papers were captured at multiple locations and transferred systematically to Washington for study. The Library of Congress holds books from Hitler's personal library, including volumes annotated in his handwriting. These came through various channels, including materials transferred from Soviet archives in the 1990s. In Germany, the Bavarian state holds items from Hitler's Munich apartment, including the authenticated Golden Party badge, several pieces of furniture, and household items. These are not on public display but are accessible to researchers. The German Historical Museum in Berlin includes some Nazi-era artifacts in its exhibitions, though few are confirmed personal possessions of Hitler. In Russia, archives hold an unknown quantity of Hitler-related material captured in Berlin. Access remains restricted. Occasional photographs emerge showing uniforms, documents, and objects in storage, but independent verification is difficult. The Russian government has been selective about what it reveals, motivated partly by ongoing political sensitivities and partly by legitimate concerns about security and preservation. Private collections worldwide hold numerous items with varying levels of authentication. Some are certainly genuine, others are questionable, fewer outright forgeries. Without transparency and expert examination, determining which is which remains a challenge for historians and collectors alike. What was definitively lost? Large quantities of uniforms and clothing were destroyed in fires at the Berghof, both during the RAF bombing raid in April 1945 and in the subsequent demolition by American forces in 1952. Hitler's furniture, artwork, and personal belongings stored in sealed sections of the Berghof tunnels were buried permanently when the entrances were filled with concrete. These items still exist but are inaccessible, and will likely remain so indefinitely. Items burned by German personnel in the Führerbunker and Reich Chancellery before Soviet capture are gone forever. This includes papers, photographs, and clothing deliberately destroyed to prevent them from being captured. The precise extent of this destruction is unknown, but witness testimony suggests significant material was lost. Objects taken as souvenirs by soldiers from all armies, American, British, Canadian, Soviet, have mostly disappeared into private hands. Some have resurfaced at auctions or estate sales. Others remain in families, sometimes with descendants unaware of what they have. Still others were discarded over the years as veterans died and relatives cleaned out attics, not recognizing the historical significance. Intentional destruction by Allied authorities also eliminated material. After the war, some officials argued that preserving Hitler's possessions risked creating a cult of personality even in death. Certain items were destroyed specifically to prevent them from becoming relics. How much was destroyed and what specifically was lost is poorly documented. The irony is that for a man who was photographed obsessively, who appeared in countless newsreels, and whose image was reproduced on millions of posters, stamps and publications, remarkably little physical trace remains. His bunker is buried beneath a parking lot in Berlin. His mountain house is a ruin overgrown with trees. His Munich apartment is private property, its interior altered beyond recognition. The uniforms he wore nearly every day for 12 years exist in fragments, scattered across continents, with contested provenance and unclear histories. This scarcity is, in many ways, deliberate. Germany has worked systematically to deny Hitler a physical legacy. Sites associated with him have been destroyed or repurposed. Objects have been kept from public view. Documentation has been controlled carefully. The goal is to remember the history without venerating the individual. The challenge is that absence creates mystery, and mystery can be as dangerous as glorification. Historians continue searching for answers. New documents emerge occasionally from archives. Families come forward with items kept hidden for decades. Auction houses offer pieces for sale with dubious documentation, prompting debates about authenticity. Each new discovery adds complexity rather than clarity to the story. What happened to Hitler's personal effects after 1945 is ultimately a story about how societies grapple with uncomfortable history. Do we preserve every artifact as evidence? Do we destroy relics to prevent misuse? Do we allow private ownership and market forces to determine what survives? Every nation involved in World War II has answered these questions differently, and those answers continue evolving. The uniforms, medals, and everyday objects that once belonged to Adolf Hitler are now points of historical, legal, and ethical debate. They exist in fragments across the world, in archives, in museums, in private collections, in buried tunnels, in storage facilities with restricted access. They are studied by historians, sought by collectors, debated by ethicists, and hidden by governments. They are reminders that history is not just ideas and events, but also things, objects that people made, used, captured, preserved, destroyed, and fought over long after the battles ended. The artifacts matter because they are evidence. They document a life and a regime. They raise questions about memory, responsibility, and how we engage with the material remnants of the past. That Hitler's personal possessions have largely vanished is not an accident. It is the result of deliberate choices made by individuals and institutions over 80 years. Understanding what happened to them helps us understand how we remember World War II and why those memories remain contentious decades after the war's end.